All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Kiana Irvin, an assistant professor of history at MU. I work with Dr. Gary Kramer, who's the executive director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, and Mary Ellen Lohman, the senior strategic communications associate, also of the Historical Society. And together we bring scholars of the Black past in this state to the MU campus. And we'd like to extend our deepest thanks to the programs and the institutions that make this endeavor possible, namely the Missouri Humanities Council, the State Historical Society of Missouri, and the University of Missouri's Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. Our speaker this evening, Patrick Huber, is professor of history at Missouri University of Science and Technology, where he has taught for the past 17 years. He received his BA and MA degrees from the University of Missouri-Columbia and his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research focuses on American social and cultural history during the period between 1890 and 1945, with special emphasis on popular music, the U.S. South, race relations, and working class culture. Huber is the author or editor of 6 books, including the 1920s, American Popular Culture Through History, The Hank Williams Reader, and Lithead Stomp, The Creation of Country Music in the Piedmont South, the latter of which won, among other awards, the American Folklore Society's 2010 Wayland D. Hand Prize. He has published more than 70 articles and essays covering topics that include lynchings and race riots, the southernness of country music, the history of the word redneck, and even the meaning of hillbilly-themed souvenirs. He has also examined topics related specifically to Missouri history, among them old-time fiddling contests in Jefferson City, hazing rituals at Missouri S&T, Dizzy Dean's broadcasting career, and the 1923 lynching of James T. Scott that occurred here in Columbia. His most recent book, A&R Pioneers, Architects of American Roots Music on Record, will be published in 2018. In 2015, Huber was among the first recipients of the Center for Missouri Studies Fellowship from the State Historical Society of Missouri, which funded much of the research you will hear presented tonight. Professor Huber will sign copies of his book after the question and answer period, and please welcome him to the podium.
Well, good evening to you all. It's a pleasure to be here and to be back at my alma mater. I'd like to thank you all for coming out, and in particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Kramer, Dr. Irvin, and Mary Ellen Lohman for making all the necessary arrangements and for inviting me to speak with you tonight to share some of my research about the St. Genevieve Race Riot of 1930. My research project seeks to restore this incident to its proper place in the larger history of that small Missouri town, to understand the event, which has long been shrouded in public silence, how it affected the community, and how after the passage of more than 80 years, it's remembered there today. This project, which represents more than 20 years of research, is a very personal endeavor for me because St. Genevieve is my hometown. And this evening, I'd like to explain what happened during that incident and to discuss how in the decades since it has been remembered or more frequently been forgotten. The St. Genevieve Race Riot, as it was called in contemporary newspaper accounts, was a 4-day racial disturbance in mid-October 1930, during which white armed vigilantes drove nearly all the black residents from the town, including a dozen or so families whose ancestors had lived there for decades. St. Genevieve, of course, was not the only Missouri community to experience racial violence and a subsequent black exodus during the Jim Crow era. Among the more notorious incidents, mobs in Pierce City in 1901, in Joplin in 1903, and in Springfield in 1906, all staged lynchings that escalated into either full-blown race riots or threatened riots, and consequently caused black residents to flee those communities. Compared to those episodes, however, the St. Genevieve Race Riot was unusual because it was characterized not by a frenzy of mob killings and property destruction, but rather by mob intimidation and threatened violence. Except for the double murder of 2 white men that triggered the racial disorder, no bloodshed actually occurred during the St. Genevieve incident, which might be more accurately described as a near riot or an averted riot. Nonetheless, white vigilantes succeeded in St. Genevieve, as they did through more murderous and destructive means elsewhere, in permanently driving off most of the town's African American population. In doing so, the mob's actions destroyed St. Genevieve's long-standing African American community and irrevocably changed the racial composition of the town. For decades, the story of what one resident calls the secret sin of St. Genevieve was absent from many of the local histories of that old historic town. Founded around 1750, St. Genevieve holds the distinction of being Missouri's oldest permanent settlement. It also contains the largest concentration of surviving French colonial buildings in North America, and historic tourism remains one of the town's leading industries, along with lime mining. But in this small, tightly knit community, so dedicated to preserving its past, townspeople have, until rather recently, developed a collective amnesia about the St. Genevieve Race Riot of 1930, arguably the single most important event in the town's history. Other than contemporary newspaper coverage, the first published account of the riot did not appear until 1999 in a brief essay in a coffee table photograph book titled St. Genevieve, A Leisurely Stroll Through History, almost 70 years after the incident. Since then, articles about the riot have appeared in several Missouri newspapers, including the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and in numerous books, including the Encyclopedia of American Race Riots. There is now even a novel about the riot, Gone by Sundown, which was published in 2011 by the St. Louis writer Peter Leach. Still, the race riot remains virtually unknown today to entire generations of St. Genevieve residents, and those who know anything about it, those few who are still surviving, seldom discuss it publicly. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about what St. Genevieve was like on the eve of the race riot. In 1930, the town was a major lime manufacturing center that contained 2,600 residents, the overwhelming majority of which were white Catholics descended from French and German settlers. Approximately 170 African American residents also lived in the town or on its outskirts, with an equal number scattered throughout St. Genevieve County. Race relations in St. Genevieve were complicated by the fact that at the time, 2 distinct black communities actually existed there. One group consisted of about 80 longtime residents, many of whom were descended from St. Genevieve County slaves or free people of color. Some were of mixed French and African heritage. For example, the Rabot family had owned a large farm south of town since 1840. They spoke French and English fluently and were active members in the Roman Catholic Church. The other group of black residents consisted of about 90 Southern migrants, chiefly from Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas, who had arrived beginning in the mid-1920s to work in the local lime plants and rock quarries. Most of them were Protestants, owned little property, and lived in a shanty town near the railroad depot known as the Shacks, or in labor camps on the outskirts of town. Apparently, these 2 black communities seldom interacted with one another. During the 1920s, racial tensions escalated with the arrival of these Southern migrants. Many white townspeople regarded the Shacks as a dangerous vice district. Rough men of both races met there to drink, gamble, and carouse. But as one local white resident complained at the time, St. Genevieve law enforcement officials, quote, pay no attention to the hoodlum element and make no public objection to the intermingling of the lower elements of both races. Drinking, gambling, and other forms of vice are not denounced so long as they remain in the background, close quote. In 1929, the year before the riot, 2 black migrants had shot and killed one another near the shacks in an argument over a woman. And such gunplay and violence, combined with a string of robberies attributed to the migrants, disturbed both white and black longtime St. Genevieve residents. Although most of the migrants caused no trouble, collectively they came to be seen what one local resident called a menace to the community. Their presence also heightened economic anxieties. As banks foreclosed on farms and the Depression deepened in St. Genevieve County, competition for decent paying industrial jobs further soured race relations. So on the eve of the riot then, long-standing town residents and black newcomers maintained an uneasy coexistence, separated from one another by suspicions and resentments that created a tense undercurrent in the town. The trouble that triggered the St. Genevieve Race Riot began on Saturday night, October 11th, 1930, when 2 white limekiln workers named Harry Panshaw, aged 40, and Paul Ritter, age 38, attended a black dance at the shacks. At around 12:50 a.m. on Sunday morning, October 12th, as the dance was breaking up, 2 black migrants and their female companion offered the 2 white men $1.50 to drive them to a craps game at Little Rock Landing, 2 miles north of town. According to Ritter, when the group arrived at the boat landing, the 2 black men drew revolvers, ordered him to stop the automobile, and then robbed him and Panshaw of a pocket watch, a fountain pen, and $45 in cash. Then, allegedly without provocation, one of them shot Panshaw in the chest at point-blank range, killing him instantly, and then wounded Ritter in the abdomen, paralyzing him from the waist down. Seeking to conceal their crime, the 2 gunmen then, according to Ritter, took the white men to the riverbank and dumped them into the Mississippi River. The frigid water revived Ritter, and after the gunmen realized that he was still alive, they began hurling large rocks at him, one of which struck him in the skull, fracturing it and knocking him unconscious. Some 30 minutes later, federal prohibition agents who were nearby guarding a confiscated bootlegger's boat heard Ritter's cry for help. They rescued him and then fished Panshaw's body from the river. Ritter was rushed by ambulance to St. Louis, where he was admitted to St. Anthony's Hospital in critical condition. Within hours of the shooting, St. Genevieve County Sheriff Louis Ziegler and his deputies launched an intensive manhunt for the suspects and soon arrested 3 migrants whom a witness had seen leaving the dance in Ritter's Chevy sedan. Lonnie Taylor was a 31-year-old quarry worker originally from Tennessee. Columbus Jennings, his friend, was age 23 and a Mississippi native who worked at the very same quarry. And Vera Rogers, who was 27, whom a St. Genevieve newspaper ominously described as, quote, an underworld character from the Crystal City Negro District, who it said stabbed a man there, close quote. Meanwhile, news of Panshaw's murder and Ritter's wounding spread rapidly throughout St. Genevieve and the surrounding countryside. And as Sunday Mass led out at the Catholic Church, a crowd of about 500 people assembled across the street from the courthouse to await news. Meanwhile, after an intensive interrogation inside the courthouse, Columbus Jennings and Vera Rogers confessed to their roles in the crime, but they claimed that Lonnie Taylor was the actual trigger man. Confronted with his accomplice's signed statements, Taylor admitted that he had shot the 2 white men, but he insisted that he had done so in self-defense. He had shot them, Taylor told authorities, during a fist fight that had broken out after Paul Ritter had insulted Vera Rogers by offering her 50 cents to have sex with him. "Don't you want to do some business with me tonight?" Taylor remembered Ritter propositioning Rogers. What actually precipitated the shootings will probably forever remain a mystery. But after ringing confessions from the three suspects, Sheriff Ziegler and his deputies transported them 30 miles north for safekeeping to Hillsborough, to the jail there, in order to prevent a lynching by the angry crowd in St. Genevieve. Later that Sunday night, having been deprived of the opportunity to murder the three suspects, armed bands of white men in automobiles visited the black settlements in St. Genevieve and on its outskirts and ordered residents to leave town by the next day, 5 p.m., or face serious reprisals. The self-appointed vigilantes made no distinction between longtime residents and recent newcomers. All African Americans, regardless of family background or length of residence, were banished from St. Genevieve. On Monday morning, October 13th, the exodus began, and by the end of the day, nearly all 170 residents had fled the town. Black residents had fled the town. Many of the refugees, according to newspaper accounts, headed to St. Louis or Crystal City or Poplar Bluff, while others sought refuge in the nearby towns of St. Mary's and Kaufman. Meanwhile, in the midst of this exodus, another mob apparently formed, and Sheriff Ziegler, fearing an outbreak of violence against black residents, telephoned Governor Henry S. Caulfield to request the assistance of the National Guard in maintaining order in the town. The governor immediately dispatched companies M and H of the 140th Infantry from Festus and DeSoto to St. Genevieve to prevent any further disturbances. Approximately 90 National Guardsmen arrived in St. Genevieve on Monday afternoon. They set up machine guns around the courthouse and they patrolled the town for the remainder of the night. By then, only 3, perhaps as many as 4, black families remained in St. Genevieve, at least one of which sought protection in the parish rectory with Father Charles Van Torenhout, the longtime pastor of the local Catholic Church. The next morning, Tuesday, October 14th, convinced that order had been restored, the National Guard troops withdrew from a quiet St. Genevieve. But when the second shooting victim, Paul Ritter, died that afternoon at St. Anthony's Hospital, news of his death triggered renewed mob action in St. Genevieve. Around 10:30 p.m., 3 carloads of white men armed with shotguns and rifles attempted to kidnap a mail carrier by the name of Louis Cap Rabot, one of the few black residents who had defied the mob's orders to leave St. Genevieve. The mob seized Rabot and dragged him from his home, but while the mob members were huddled on the road to deliberate what to do with him, an approaching car collided with one of the mob's parked cars and plowed into the group. Several people were knocked down, including Cap Rabot himself, but in the ensuing chaos, he managed to escape into the woods. Sheriff Ziegler and his deputies quickly arrived on the scene and arrested 6 white St. Genevieve men: Herman Steiger, James Hurst, Lewis Ryan, Russell Stokely, James Crowley, and William Martin. When a rumor began to circulate that a mob might attempt to spring these men from the jail, the sheriff, fearing that he could not repel such an assault, again telephoned Governor Caulfield to request the assistance of the National Guard. And companies M and H, whose members had only hours before returned to their homes, rushed back to St. Genevieve. The next morning, Wednesday, October 15th, Cap Rabot boarded a train for St. Louis under the protection of armed federal guards. He was, as one newspaper put it, in a, quote, highly nervous state from his traumatic experience, and he was admitted for treatment at the St. Louis City Sanitarium. That afternoon, St. Genevieve civic leaders and National Guard officers held a mass meeting at the courthouse to discuss how best to end the racial unrest. Among those who addressed the standing room only crowd was Father Van Turenhout, who urged residents to cooperate in combating the racial strife that was racking the town. Quote, St. Genevieve has always boasted openly of its good name and its law-abiding citizens, the priest told the crowd. If this is true, it is now your duty to curb in every way possible the spirit of racial animosity that has been expressing itself during the last few days. That evening, the local post of the American Legion also called an emergency meeting, during which time its members volunteered to assist local law enforcement officers in quelling any future mob outbreaks. The Legionnaires also adopted a resolution guaranteeing protection to what they called, quote, certain native property-owning blacks, should they wish to return to their homes. But according to the Legionnaires, absolutely no other African Americans would be permitted to return to St. Genevieve. By the following day, Thursday, October 16th, the crisis in the community had subsided. And that afternoon, the National Guard troops, whose presence very likely prevented the outbreak of a full-blown race riot, withdrew from the town. Their departure marked the end of what one local newspaper called, quote, one of the most serious situations ever experienced in St. Genevieve. But the aftershocks of that 4-day disturbance would reverberate for decades to come. And perhaps most immediately, the event had an impact, obviously, on those men who were arrested for trying to run Cap Rabeau out of town and the 3 murder suspects. On October 15th, following the mass meeting, the 6 men who were arrested trying to kidnap Rabeau were tried in court and pled guilty on a reduced charge of unlawful assembly. Each was fined $300 and sentenced to 6 months in jail or both, but the judge stayed their sentences on promise of good behavior, and that evening the men returned to their families. 2 days later, though, United States postal inspectors rearrested the 6 men, this time on federal warrants, charging them with conspiracy to prevent a U.S. government employee from performing his duties, a crime that was punishable by a maximum sentence of 6 years in prison. Except for these 6 men, no white St. Genevieve residents were ever charged in connection with the mob actions that drove out the town's black residents, nor did any ever serve jail time. In March 1931, all 6 of the defendants pled guilty in a U.S. District Court in St. Louis and were sentenced to 30 days in jail, but they were immediately paroled. Meanwhile, Lonnie Taylor and Columbus Jennings were tried in Farmington, Missouri on a change of venue for the first-degree murders of Panshaw and Ritter. Taylor pled not guilty at his February 1931 trial, but it took a jury only 1 hour to convict him, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. His lawyers subsequently appealed his case to the Missouri Supreme Court, which overturned his conviction due to prosecutorial error and granted him a new trial. And at his second trial in December 1932, Taylor pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 2 life terms in the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. Columbus Jennings, in an earlier separate trial in June 1931, also pled guilty and received 2 life sentences. The case against their female companion, Vera Rogers, was dismissed. And parenthetically, I'd note that Taylor and Jennings' defense attorneys were Sidney Redmond and Henry Espy of St. Louis, both of whom, as many of you are probably aware, would go on to represent Lloyd Gaines in his lawsuit against the University of Missouri's law school that culminated in a landmark 1938 United States Supreme Court decision, Civil Rights Supreme Court decision. In the week following the riot, Father Van Turenhout and other St. Genevieve civic leaders invited some 80 longtime black residents who had fled their homes to return to the community. Eventually, all of them did, including Capra Bow, but none of the black Southern migrants were allowed to return, and the town's African American population never again reached pre-riot levels. In fact, St. Genevieve gained a reputation as a town that was hostile to African Americans. By 1940, the town's black community had dwindled to only 45 residents. By 1960, only 19 remained. And when I was growing up there in the 1970s, as I recall, only one extended black family lived in the town. Today, St. Genevieve's African American population has increased significantly, and in 2010, it stood at 70 residents. Still, those 70 residents comprise less than 2% of the town's 4,400 residents in a state where African Americans make up nearly 12% of the population. Despite its significant impact on the town, the St. Genevieve Race Riot faded into obscurity rather quickly. During the 18 years I spent growing up there, I never once heard about this incident. It was not until 1988, when I was a junior here at the university, that I first learned about the riot from a priest named Father John Boulderson, who had taught me religion at the parochial high school I had attended. He had heard about the incident, he told me, from an older priest, the Monsignor, who had served as the pastor in St. Genevieve when he was there. At the time I learned this news, I was majoring in history, and discovering that a race riot had occurred in my hometown in 1930, fewer than 40 years before I was born, stunned me, to say the least. How could I not have known about the incident? How could an event that had been so public and so traumatic have been so thoroughly expunged from St. Genevieve's collective memory? The story of the St. Genevieve Race Riot both troubled and intrigued me, and I soon began to try to reconstruct what had happened and to figure out why memories of it had almost completely disappeared from the public discourse. In fact, discovering this incident inspired me in large part to become a professional historian. So, for more than 2 decades now, in my spare time, I've been compiling newspaper accounts, court records, census data, and other documents with the intention of someday publishing a book about the race riot. And through this process, I have come to understand how it was that I never learned about the incident while I was growing up in St. Genevieve. The St. Genevieve Race Riot was, I discovered, deliberately forgotten, at least as a subject for public discussion and commemoration. That process of collective forgetting was launched in contemporary St. Genevieve newspaper accounts, particularly the St. Genevieve Herald. Remembering is usually considered an active process, while forgetting is seen as a passive one. But in this instance, the process of collective forgetting was an active endeavor, as St. Genevieve civic leaders deliberately worked to minimize the significance of the riot and to sweep it aside as quickly as possible. The St. Genevieve Race Riot of 1930 had attracted extensive newspaper coverage, not only in Missouri, but across the nation, including in the St. Louis dailies, but also in the Chicago Daily Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. And this unwelcome publicity had done much to tarnish the reputation of St. Genevieve, which already in 1930 was beginning to promote itself as a historical tourism destination. Not surprisingly, the most damaging blows to the town's image came from Missouri's African American weekly newspapers. The St. Louis Argus, for example, reported that St. Genevieve had, quote, suddenly been transformed into a seething cauldron of race hatred, end quote, and charged that a local white physician named Claire Clapsaddle, and members of the Knights of Columbus had actually spearheaded the expulsion of black residents from the town. Quote, "We regret very, very much that this outburst of race hatred happened in what is known as a Catholic city and community," the St. Louis Argus editorialized. "We had looked upon Catholics as having something in common with Negroes, in that the church was free not only of members of the Ku Klux Klan, but of the spirit of the Klan. But the happenings at St. Genevieve during the past week have disabused our minds on this subject," close quote. Even as the race riot was still unfolding, civic leaders in St. Genevieve were already attempting to downplay the riot's importance and to minimize the damage to the town's reputation. In the St. Genevieve Herald, for example, in its coverage, the newspaper's editor, Frank Ernst, refused to describe the incident as a riot or to characterize the white vigilantes as a mob. For Ernst, the riot was an unfortunate but justifiable and indeed necessary intervention that would prevent future outbreaks of lawlessness by driving off what he called, quote, "members of an undesirable itinerant element sent in here from the extreme southern limits of the country," close quote. Instead of recounting the details of the riot, Ernst devoted a disproportionate share of his coverage to defending the town and its citizens against what he called, quote, "grossly exaggerated rumors spread in the press and otherwise that told of burning homes, riots, mob killings, and general pandemonium." The editor blamed such unfounded accounts on the St. Louis daily newspapers, whose reporters he charged, quote, "evidently drew on their prolific imaginations to paint as black and revolting a picture as possible for the purpose of selling extra copies of their newspapers, regardless of the injury such wild statements would do to the good name of our city and to the feelings of citizens in general." Father Charles Van Turenhout also joined the efforts to lessen the negative publicity generated by the riot. In a letter written to the St. Louis Argus a few days after the riot, the Catholic pastor responded to that newspaper's damning article and editorial by explaining that the mob members who expelled the town's black residents were, quote, "irresponsible parties who are not representative of our community and are newcomers here, some of them having been in conflict with the law before." There is absolutely no race hatred on the part of the people of St. Genevieve, the pastor claimed rather preposterously. The Catholic Church is the best friend of our colored brother, and nowhere will he be more safe and kindlier treated than here in St. Genevieve. In the ensuing decades, little public mention was made of the race riot, and subsequent histories of the town simply ignored it. For example, in 1935, in the book St. Genevieve, the story of Missouri's oldest settlement, it omitted any mention of the event, noting, quote, "of the past 35 years, there is little that is striking to record." As I mentioned previously, it was not until 1999 that the photograph book, St. Genevieve, A Leisurely Stroll Through History, finally broke the nearly 70 years of public silence enshrouding the race riot. At first glance, the book's account of that incident appeared to be a daring expose and an act of historical commemoration. But in some ways, it actually helped to reinforce the collective amnesia surrounding the riot. It did not, for example, mention Lonnie Taylor's accusation that Paul Ritter had sexually propositioned Vera Rogers, nor did it identify any of the 6 men who pled guilty to harassing Capra Bow. Perhaps the book's authors, all of whom are St. Genevieve residents, feared alienating their friends and neighbors in a small town where, as locals like to say, everybody knows everybody. In some ways, then, this book actually helped to facilitate the collective amnesia about the race riot by eliding the more controversial details and thus sanitizing the event for current or former St. Genevieve residents. At some level, then, collective forgetting was achieved through highly selective remembering. In 2000, after taking a job at what was then the University of Missouri-Rolla, I began to conduct oral history interviews with residents who remembered the race riot or who had heard stories about it. Traditional written sources, I realized, could only provide the broadest outlines of that episode, and through my oral history project, I hope to be able to collect lost narratives that had been omitted from the historical record. As you might guess, a sense of urgency fueled my oral history project. Unfortunately, by the time I began conducting interviews, most of the major participants and eyewitnesses had already died, including Columbus Jennings, one of the convicted murderers, who passed away in Chicago only a few months before I launched my interview project, unbeknownst to me at the time. But the passage of time also proved to have a silver lining. Because so many of the figures involved in the riot had died, and because the event had retreated so far into the past, most of the nearly 40 people I interviewed seemed willing to discuss the event with me, and despite the sensitive nature of the subject, to speak candidly about it. Thus, I found that while the riot had fallen victim to decades of collective amnesia, it persisted in the personal memories and family lores of dozens of longtime St. Genevieve residents. And through these interviews, a multidimensional portrait emerged of how the residents of this small community dealt with and processed the memories of this shameful episode in their past. One of my earliest interviews was with Harry Panshaw, the grandson and namesake of one of the 1930 murder victims, who in 2001 had read an account of the riot in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, for which I had served as a consultant, and he telephoned me and said he'd like to talk. Panshaw was born in Michigan in 1939, so he never knew his grandfather, but he shared several stories about him with me. His grandfather, he said, was a, quote, boozer, a dancer, and a partier who enjoyed drinking and carousing with African Americans. But Panshaw had little knowledge of his grandfather's murder or of the subsequent race riot that it sparked. He did tell me that his family was extremely poor, and after they returned to St. Genevieve about 1945, they lived in a 2-room tar paper shack along with his widowed grandmother, the Harry Panshaw's widow, in a shanty town near Little Rock Landing. 3 African American families lived nearby, but around 1948, the Ku Klux Klan burned 3 crosses on the railroad tracks opposite those family shanties, and Panshaw recalled shortly after that, those black residents moved away. Given Panshaw's close familial connection to the riot, one would have expected that information about that incident would have flowed from him to me. But in this case, much of it flowed in the opposite direction, as I was able to relate details about his grandfather's murder and about the riot that Panshaw did not know, because such information had never been discussed by his family or it had been forgotten over the years. Some longtime residents of St. Genevieve, I discovered, still refuse to talk about the race riot at all. I had only limited success, for example, in interviewing the town's few remaining longtime black residents, including Charlie Basile, the son of the family that Father Van Torenhout had harbored during the riot. Basile was born in St. Genevieve, but in 1935, and although his parents had shared family stories with him about this painful episode, he refused to talk about the riot with anyone. In 1999, shortly after the book St. Genevieve, A Leisurely Stroll Through History was published, Basile approached one of its authors and told him that his account of the riot in the book was, quote, unquote, all wrong. But Basile refused to identify the inaccuracies or to correct the historical record, despite this author, a native of St. Genevieve, asking him to do so. Basile implied that there was more to the event than what was recounted in the book, and that he seemed to possess what he considered the quote-unquote true story of the riot. But given the lingering trauma of the event, or perhaps his reluctance to alienate friends and neighbors, he wanted to suppress the story. Another example of how over the decades this event has fallen victim to a culture of collective silence. And unfortunately, whatever those details were, Basil apparently took them with him to his grave when he passed away in 2012. Other informants were more forthcoming in sharing information about the riot with me. But even after all these decades, some of them were still afraid of compromising their current relationships. Certainly, my family connections and roots in the community opened doors for me. But nonetheless, it's clear that a sort of community firewall still suppresses sensitive details about the riot and protects fellow townspeople whose fathers and grandfathers participated in the vigilante actions. Very few informants, for example, were willing to divulge the names of the alleged mob members, even off the record. One man who wished to remain anonymous refused to let me tape record my interview with him, but he spoke with me for 2 hours because, as he put it, he was, quote, too damned old to get implicated in this incident. Mr. X, as I'll call him, later confessed that he didn't want to get involved because he and his wife played cards with the daughter of one of the men arrested for attempting to run Capra Bow out of town. Incidentally, Mr. X's wife's uncle had been among the defendants who had been convicted of that crime. Mr. X did, however, provide me with the name of his card-playing friend and recommend that I interview her. But he made me promise that I wouldn't mention his name when I contacted her. The interviews I conducted proved extremely valuable in recovering information about the riot that went undocumented in contemporary newspaper accounts and court records. Some informants, for example, offered memories that contradicted the official narrative of the race riot. That account attributed the murders of Penshaw and Ritter to a bungled holdup. Interestingly, though, many of the white St. Genevieve residents I spoke to never accepted that story. Instead, several informants agreed more closely with Lonnie Taylor's version of the shooting, that the two white men were killed during an argument sparked by Ritter's propositioning of Vera Rogers. Mr. X, for example, had heard that Ritter and Penshaw were murdered because, as he put it, they were, quote, probably chasing nigger gals. Why else, he wondered, would the two white men have crashed the black dance on the night of the shootings? They had no right to be there, Mr. X told me. And if they were carousing with black women, he said that he didn't blame Taylor for shooting the two white men. Other counter memories focused on the social status of the mob's ringleaders. Some informants told me, for example, that rather than being marginal members of St. Genevieve, as Father Turenhout had claimed in his 1930 letter to the St. Louis Argus, several of the riot's instigators were pillars of the community. By casting the mob's leaders as unrepresentative of St. Genevieve, Father Van Turenhout had employed a common strategy to minimize the importance of the race riot and to encourage the collective forgetting of the incident. But if indeed, as the St. Louis Argus charged and the St. Genevieve Herald denied, some of St. Genevieve's leading citizens had orchestrated the expulsion of African American residents, and the mob's actions did, in fact, reflect the will of the greater community, then Father Van Turenhout and Herald editor Frank Ernst had even more reason to bury this story as quickly as possible. The St. Genevieve Herald's 1930 coverage of the race riot hastened the collective forgetting of the event, but decades later, the same newspaper became a venue for the collective remembrance of the incident. In 2010, after hearing a presentation I gave about the incident at a history conference in St. Genevieve, Jean Rissover, the newspaper's editor, invited me to contribute an article about the riot to mark the 80th anniversary of the event. She subsequently published that article, a nearly 4,000-word piece, on the front page of the St. Genevieve Herald's October 13, 2010 edition. As a result of my article, several current and former residents who had never heard of about the riot contacted me because they were interested in learning more about it, while others reached out to me because they had eyewitness accounts to share, including Vera Dunze, an 87-year-old white woman who was a lifetime resident of St. Genevieve. Dunze was 7 years old at the time of the race riot, and her family, the Gieslers, lived next door to the Rabeau family in a racially mixed neighborhood that locals pejoratively called Mudtown. Dunze recalled that she and her family often visited with the Rabeaus, whose household consisted of 4 adult unmarried siblings, and that on summer evenings they often got together on one another's porches to eat watermelon or to talk about local events or gossip in the town. On the night that the mob came to kidnap Cap Rabeau, Dunze recalled that his sister Annie Rabeau came to the Gieslers' house in tears and told them what was happening. A few minutes later, Dunze said mob members ordered the Gieslers to leave their home and forced her father to accompany the vigilantes. Dunze, her mother, and 3 young siblings, along with Annie Rabeau, fled up the hill behind their house to one of their white neighbors. All of them were crying as they ran, Vera Dunze remembered, especially Annie, who would stop every few steps to glance back at her family home. Dunze's father later told her that the mob had intended to lynch Cap Rabeau from a bridge south of St. Genevieve. After his treatment at the St. Louis Sanitarium, Dunze remembered Cap Rabeau did return to St. Genevieve, but he descended into alcoholism. Sometimes he got drunk on his mail route and didn't finish it, and eventually he lost his job with the post office. One of her younger sisters, Dunze recalled, once told her that the race riot had affected her whole life. And around 2000, shortly after the publication of St. Genevieve, A Leisurely Stroll Through History, her sister encouraged Dunze to write a letter to the St. Genevieve Herald, recounting her own memories of the riot, but Dunze never did so. In 2010, however, after the publication of my newspaper article, she reached out and contacted me. And it was clear from our conversation that Vera Dunze, like her younger sister, had been haunted by the memories of that October night in 1930 that had so traumatically disrupted the lives of their black neighbors. Except for Dunze and a couple of others, though, few of the informants that I spoke to considered the trauma that African American residents suffered as a result of their expulsion from St. Genevieve. Indeed, in some sense, the 1930 race riot serves an important psychological need for white townspeople today, because by consigning that racist act to a long distant past, they can more easily deny the racism that continues to plague the town. We cannot know the full extent of the hardships and the humiliation endured by those African Americans who returned to St. Genevieve as they struggled to reintegrate into a hostile community from which they had been driven off. We can, however, get something of a glimpse from an interview that Lon Rabeau, the last surviving member of his family in St. Genevieve, gave in 1969, 1 month before he died. Quote, "When I went downtown, it was like the plague had come," Rabeau recalled. "I could see people just peering over their curtains. Some of them didn't stay behind their curtains. Mr. Ben Rotler, he come right out and spoke, said, 'Don't you let them scare you. You stand your ground, and if they give you any trouble, you crack some heads. I got a rifle you can have any time, and if you don't want to use it, you send for me, and I'll use it.' Mr. Will Bovary, he come out too. He said, 'Lon, nobody's going to cause you any trouble. You folks keep quiet and stay out of sight for a while, and this will all blow over. And if you want, there's always a place for you at our house.' But a lot of the people were just looking through their curtains at me like the plague." Even more hidden are the experiences of those African Americans who fled the community forever as they attempted to hold their families together and establish new roots in St. Louis, Cape Girardeau, Crystal City, or wherever else they had landed. These patterns of collective amnesia that I have identified as operating for decades in St. Genevieve constitute a broader pattern of collective forgetting that has long been committed by historians and sociologists of American racial violence. Race riots represent a disturbingly familiar story in the history of Jim Crow America, but small-town riots and near riots, such as the one that erupted in St. Genevieve, have been excluded largely from scholarly literature. In part, this is because many of these incidents went unreported or undocumented, but they've also been overlooked because of scholars' tendency to focus on larger, more dramatic, more spectacular, and more murderous race riots, such as those that devastated East St. Louis in 1917, or Chicago in 1919, or Tulsa in 1921, all of which have become notorious symbols of racial injustice and brutality in Jim Crow America. These large-scale metropolitan riots have overshadowed smaller riots and near riots that, while not nearly as murderous and therefore as memorable, occurred with far more alarming frequency. To be sure, both metropolitan and small-town riots share many similarities, notably a common set of underlying conditions and causes, but small-town riots differ in important respects. Chief among them is that riots in small towns often resulted in the complete or near complete racial cleansing of the communities in which they occurred, as their black communities vanished entirely or never fully recovered from such devastating incidents. Small town riots also accelerated the large-scale urbanization of African Americans as black refugees fled the scenes of such racial disturbances for the relative safety of larger cities like St. Louis or Chicago. In the end, it may be that small-town riots, such as the one in St. Genevieve, played a more significant role in shaping race relations in the United States during the age of Jim Crow than scholars have generally appreciated. In recent decades, the collective amnesia obscuring small-town race riots has begun to give way to collective remembrance and even public acts of commemoration. Documentary films such as Trouble Behind or Banished, How Whites Drove Blacks Out of Town in America, as well as major Hollywood motion pictures such as Rosewood, are beginning to bring such small-town episodes to light. So too are newspaper reports such as the Associated Press's 2001 three-part series, Torn from the Land, which documented what its authors called, quote, a largely untold chapter in America's violent racial history. Historical studies, including Kimberly Harper's White Man's Heaven, the lynching and expulsion of blacks in the Southern Ozarks, 1894 to 1909, James Lowen's Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism, and Elliot Jaspin's Buried in Bitter Waters, The Hidden History of Racial Cleansing in America, are also helping to undo the collective forgetting about small-town race riots and their far-reaching consequences. Interestingly, some Missouri residents, reflecting a larger national trend, have recently begun to publicly acknowledge their community's history of racial violence. In 2001, for example, a group of Pierce City residents marked the centennial of their town's race riot by erecting a monument in a local cemetery. And here in Columbia, on two separate occasions, groups of citizens have commemorated the 1923 lynching that took the life of James T. Scott. Whether St. Genevieve city officials will ever officially commemorate the 1930 race riot remains to be seen, but I hope they do. Meanwhile, the St. Genevieve race riot and dozens, perhaps hundreds of other small-town riots that occurred throughout Jim Crow America offer historians a significant opportunity to discuss the thorny, explosive issue of race and race relations at a time when, in the wake of the destructive Ferguson riots, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter campaign, and a series of highly publicized police shootings of African Americans, the nation appears more racially divided than at any time since the 1960s. By chronicling such long-hidden or ignored small-town riots and near riots, historians can help to undo much of the collective forgetting that has for so long erased such incidents from public discourse. In this regard, microhistories such as this one can serve as models that point towards a fuller and richer understanding of American race relations. They can also help to engage community members in a broader dialogue along racial lines about current issues of race and race relations in their hometowns. And for me, reconstructing as best I could a fuller account of the St. Genevieve Race Riot of 1930 and its far-reaching consequences has chiefly been an endeavor to help me and other interested residents make sense of this incident and its significance for St. Genevieve. And in doing so, this work represents what I believe is the truest purpose of history, which is to find meaning in the past that can illuminate our present world and our place within it. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions from the audience.
I suppose there's residual racism all over the country, but you indicated there might be a special flavor in St. Genevieve racism there. Or like
I don't know about a special kind of flavor, but I think the events serves an important psychological purpose by saying, it happened here, but that was decades ago, and we're nothing like that anymore. We're welcoming.
So the amnesia is pretty beautiful.
Yeah, but I think you're right. It's certainly more subtle and underground, but scratch the surface, and it very much still exists.
So you described the white perpetrators of this potential race riot and white helpers, sort of, as well. The folks who offered protection and the folks who said, I guess they weren't helpers, sorry about that. Was that typical in these small town incidences where there were white residents who offered refuge to victimized black citizens?
The only one I can speak a great deal about would be the St. Genevieve one, but other incidents that I have looked at, you do see that these events tend to reveal tensions within the white community. Obviously the superintendents of the lime plants and the rock quarries did not want their valuable workers to be driven off, because then they would be left with disruptions in their manufacturing and their operations. But yet, some Limekiln workers, employees, did. And so you often see these kinds of tensions. And going back and interviewing people today, those divisions within the white community have sort of collapsed. You don't see those much anymore. There will be people who will protect or will not reveal the names of, for example, not only the people who were convicted of trying to run Capra-Bo out, but also the alleged ringleaders who banished black residents. Very few people are willing to name names.
I'm
Yes?
interested in property ownership and transfer of property. That came up in the movie Banished. That if the people own the property, it just magically now belongs to somebody else in title and deed and county records.
I know that Torn from Land and Banished that went into that a great deal, but since most of the longtime black residents who own property did come back, eventually they did sell off that property, and I have not completed the research and the extensive research into the transfer of property as the black population began to dwindle there. But those residents who were driven off owned no land or real estate. They lived out in the labor camps.
I have a question based on sundown towns where Lowen talked about, one of the riots he talked about was in Anna, Illinois, which is 45-minute drive away from there. Have you looked at anything else in the area like that? Have you made any comparisons between the violence there? I know it was 20 years earlier, but is there a broader pattern here that you see St. Genevieve fitting?
I think there is a broader pattern there in southern Illinois and also in southeastern Missouri as well. There's a riot in Oran, Missouri in 1938. and especially in the boot heel, you already see a lot of the migrants who came to St. Genevieve first went to the boot heel counties and worked there, but they were driven out of there. They were warned to leave. Their homes were dynamited, and so they moved to St. Genevieve, which, believe it or not, had a reputation for being a very peaceful and racially enlightened town. I mean, African Americans were in St. Genevieve from the very beginning of the community. So there is a larger pattern, but I have not studied surrounding towns as much as I probably should. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you weren't able to get much from African American descendants still in St. Genevieve. Did you have any success in tracking down people who left?
I managed to find one. And it's very difficult, as you can imagine, because you have to track their families where they moved to. But I was able, through Ancestry.com, to reach out to a woman who was the granddaughter of one of the migrant family who were driven out. And I did then speak to a cousin of hers, whose mother lived in St. Genevieve and was 5 years old at the time of the riot. So she didn't have very many memories that she could share with me. But she was able to give me a general sense of how disruptive and destructive this was, and how painful it was for her grandfather, who, as she put it, he and his wife had 6 children at the time, and he lost what he considered a good job, and he had to start over again. And they started over again in Cape Girardeau. So, that's another aspect of this whole story that I wish that I was able to fill in more.
I have a question about segregation in the schools in St. Genevieve.
Mm-hmm.
What's the history of that in terms of these, the people who were there from the beginning of settlement? Were the schools integrated?
No. That's something I wasn't able to discuss, but the town had this sort of curious mixture of segregation and integration. The school was segregated. There was a quote-unquote colored public school there. The Catholic school, parochial school, was segregated as well. The Catholic church, black residents had to sit in the back pews of the church. They had to take communion. According to interviews that I did, they had to take communion after all the white parishioners had received communion. But because St. Genevieve was an older community, and especially had French roots, it wasn't residentially segregated at all. There were areas where there were high concentrations of African Americans, but a lot of the areas were mixed, racially mixed neighborhoods, like this mud town that I mentioned.
Okay, I think we'll have time for maybe one more question.
Not so much a question as a comment regarding the comment made about it, the question about whites protecting blacks. Pat, you may recall that in the work you and I did on the Maryville lynching in 1931, there was a prominent white person who protected black servants in his house as the other African Americans were being run out of town. And in fact, what happened over the next 2 years is you saw that, in that case, all the blacks were run out of town, except the few African American servants who were protected by their white protectors. And then over the next, in fact, one of them, Mildred Boone, who was the black school teacher, the school closed down. She came here to teach at Douglas School and spent the rest of her career here. But over the next 2 or 3 years, the black school closed down, the 2 black churches closed down, the fraternal and sorority lodges closed down, and you saw sheriff's auctions of the black property owners who couldn't pay taxes on them anymore were bought up by whites. And frankly, to this day, Maryville is a town that is widely regarded as a community hostile to African Americans.
Yes, the employers were the primary protectors of, I mentioned there were 3, possibly 4 black families that remained. 2 of those were protected by their employers, including Charlie Basil's father was the custodian of the Catholic Church, and hence Father Van Turenhout hid him in the rectory basement.
Let's thank Professor Huber again for the great lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we'll see you next year.